Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope those of you zooming in from the Los Angeles area are staying safe and dry during this pretty intense Los Angeles storm. Welcome to The Open Mind, a lecture and film series that brings together thought leaders at the intersection of science and culture for meaningful and relevant discussions about mental health issues. Today's program on hate and the internet and social media is the third in our three-part series on the state of hate that is sponsored by UCLA's Friends of the Semel Institute, along with our friends at UCLA's Initiative to Study Hate and the Resnick Neuropsychiatric Hospital Board of Advisors. I'm Vicki Goodman, and it is my honor to introduce today's panel of preeminent presenters. Dr. David Myers is a distinguished professor of history, the Sadie and Ludwig Kahn Chair in Jewish History at UCLA, and the director of the UCLA Initiative to Study Hate, a 3-year pilot project intended to foster cutting-edge research and high-level teaching to understand better and mitigate group-based hate. As of fall 2017, Dr. Myers served as the director of the Luskin Center for History and Policy. Dr. Christine Ong, is a research scientist at CREST, which stands for the Center for Research on Evaluation Standards and Student Testing, a world-renowned research and development center at the forefront of improving the quality of learning. Having worked in the field of educational research and evaluation for over 10 years, Dr. Ong currently co-directs an evaluation of the STEM Teacher in Advanced Residency, STAR program at Cal State University Dominguez Hills that is funded by the U.S. Department of Education. And Sadia Gabriel, PhD, Assistant Professor of Computer Science at UCLA, who's also affiliated with the Bunch Center for African American Studies. Her work has explored robustness and fairness of hate speech detection and has been covered by a wide range of media outlets like Forbes and TechCrunch. We would like to thank all of our distinguished panelists for taking the time from their busy schedules to share their knowledge about hate and the internet and social media with us. Few housekeeping notes before we begin. Today's program will run for approximately 1 hour, with the last segment reserved for your questions. If you would like to ask any of our panelists a question, we ask that you please type it into the Q&A, which is located at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We'll do our best to get to as many questions as possible during the time allotted. And today's program is being recorded. It will be available for viewing on our website starting tomorrow, friendsofsemelinstitute.org. There you will also find a calendar of upcoming programs, videos from past events, and information about our Open Mind Film Festival for high school students and our Teen Advisory Council that is hosting their second annual Gen Z Wellness Summit at UCLA on March 2nd. Be sure to tell all the high school and college students you know about this free day dedicated to teen mental health and well-being. Again, more information can be found on our website. That's friendsofsemelinstitute.org. Now let's learn about hate and the internet and social media and give a warm Zoom welcome to Dr. David Myers, Dr. Christine Ong, and Dr. Sadia Gabriel. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Vicki. It's really good to be back with the Friends of Semel for this third event in the series co-sponsored by the Resnick Brain Institute and the UCLA Initiative to Study Hate. Just another brief word on the Initiative to Study Hate. In the course of our three years of existence, we've grown into a scholarly community of over 100 researchers who populate 35 teams exploring hate from a wide range of disciplinary perspectives, from neuroscience to political science to computer science. And as Vicki said, we don't just try to study hate, but we also try to mitigate it. And in that vein, I'd like to invite you all to attend a series of events with the renowned British psychoanalyst Adam Phillips, who will be coming to UCLA to deliver 3 talks, including one at the Hammer Museum on hate and kindness, over the course of 2 days, February 26th, 27th. You can find out more about this visit, which is taking place under the rubric of the Compassionate Conversations series, by checking out our website, studyofhate.ucla.edu. But tonight, we'll be following up on our earlier sessions on hate in the brain in June 2024 and hate and politics last month, as we turn our attention to hate and social media. It goes without saying that social media is a ubiquitous presence in our lives. Estimates are that more than 70% of Americans and nearly 75% of Chinese people are active users of social media. This pervasive use, it would seem, is irreversible. And there are many benefits to such connectivity: the transmission of knowledge, the execution of commerce, the creation of virtual community. But as we know, there are also serious risks, including and especially the dissemination of content that is inappropriate, offensive, dangerous, and indeed hate-filled. And on that note, I've mentioned before at our earlier sessions that hate is a notoriously difficult term to define. But for the purposes of our conversation, I'll offer a quick take. Hate is a strong, some would say super emotion, that unlike others is not fleeting, but endures and has a desired outcome, which is the elimination or the serious degradation of that which is hated. Once upon a time, many of us looked upon the internet with a great deal of promise as the grand democratizer of knowledge, readily accessible to all. And indeed, the ease with which we procure knowledge, or for that matter, merchandise, online is astounding. But our virtual world is also a dark and perilous one, and social media serves as a force multiplier of hateful and violent material. Just yesterday, a colleague of ours at UCLA, Dr. Dan Fessler, sent out a paper to us that he and 3 other colleagues produced on the persistence of hate speech, as represented by a doubling of hate speech likes in 2022-2023 on a prominent social media platform. A great part of the danger, of course, emanates from the lack of regulation of restrictions on hate speech. And some of that is about a kind of understandable tension between the desire to keep social media safe, to monitor social media on one hand, and a robust commitment to free speech. But of course, part of the problem is also that those called upon to patrol, monitor, regulate social media platforms are usually the same ones interested in promoting their widespread use. That is to say, tech companies. What are we to do, and where are we to go? These are the questions that we'll be taking up tonight with 2 wonderful colleagues whom I'm privileged to work with at the UCLA Initiative to Study Hate, Dr. Sajja Gabriel from the Department of Computer Science, and Dr. Christine Ong, whom I know as an integral member of the Social Media and Study of Hate team, otherwise known as the SMASH team, from the School of Education and Information Sciences at UCLA. So let us jump right in. I'd like to ask both of you, Sajja and then Christine, tell us who you are and what you work on. What brings you to tonight? In other words, what's your take as a researcher on the intersection of hate and social media? So Sajja, we'll maybe start with you. Hi.
Hi, yeah, so I'll go first. Thank you to Vicky for the wonderful summary. So I study computational models for understanding and mimicking human language, and I focused on hate speech spread over social media for much of my research career and the development of AI models for identifying cases of toxic language and in particular hate speech. I've collaborated within academia and industry on projects looking at biases of these AI classifiers that are trained on social media data, mostly from Twitter and Reddit. This work started with an ACL paper early in my PhD research that got some attention because of the striking finding that we had that commonly used hate speech classifiers like Google Perspective API, which are still in use widely today, had racial biases that could actually end up with them discriminating against the very groups that are most commonly targeted by hate speech. We had some follow-up work after that looking into how to incorporate more context, particularly about speakers and how identity might inform harmfulness of content. One of these follow-up projects was the Toxygen project, which was a joint effort with Microsoft research and product teams, where we're looking into ways of collecting data to improve on some of the gaps in existing hate speech detection benchmarks and deal with the cases of inequity that we'd seen with the existing hate speech classifiers. I'm currently a PI for an initiative to study hate project that's led by my PhD student Ashima, where we're investigating the role of people's experiences and how they annotate hate speech, and how do we incorporate voices from targeted communities into the development of content moderation systems to enable more equitable and holistic content moderation.
Great. You've given us enough to work with, and I just want to remind people that if they have questions, they should put them in the Q&A section of the screen at the bottom. And there's a lot to unpack there, Sajid, which we'll try to do over the course of the evening. But Christine, tell us about yourself.
Sure. So it's a pleasure to be here, especially on this rainy night. Again, I'm Christine, and I've worked in educational research for a while in a range of projects, but SMASH is near and dear to me, and I'm so fortunate to be a part of it. So this work, SMASH, like David said, involves researchers from our School of Education and Information Studies, but also a nonprofit, the nonprofit called Organization for Social Media Safety. And they provide programming to schools. They're based in Los Angeles, but work with students in schools across the country, grades 5 through 12. They provide programming directly to students as well as to parents, and working with teachers and administrators on their guidelines. But their goal is to provide or increase awareness around some of the risks and harms that students can encounter on social media, whether that be around sexting or hate speech, cyberbullying, as well as strategies to be safe online. So through this partnership, we're able to work with them and analyze data that they gather through their presentations. So for students, they have a presentation, again, talking about these strategies and harms, and they're asked during the course of the hour questions about their own experiences. Have you been cyberbullied? The last month, have you seen hate speech? And so for those schools that don't opt out of the research, we're able to analyze these data. Just a quick headline of some of the things that we're finding. And at this point, we've been doing this with OFSMS since around February of 2023. So we've got 29,000, I think, responses. These are handheld clickers that students answer during the presentation. It's anonymous. So what we're finding is that 8 in 10, roughly, students are reporting that, yes, they have seen hate speech in the last month, which is a large number.
Well, yeah, I was going to ask you about the frequency, and Sajid can weigh in on this as well, but that you've answered that part of my next question. What types of hate do we find on social media, especially in those sectors that you're investigating? And one thing that might be really instructive for the audience to hear about is how hate speech that appears in social media might be different from hate speech that appears in other spheres, on other kinds of media of maybe a 20th century vintage. So, Christine, you want to jump in since you gave us some sense of
Sure.
numbers?
Sure. So within the programming, they're also able, or I'm not doing the programming, our wonderful partner Ed Peisner does this, ask about particular types of hate speech, such as hate speech related to religious beliefs, gender, race, ethnicity. And again, we see majority saying yes, they have seen that. In the last year, we've been able to pilot a survey with undergraduates here at UCLA, asking some of the same questions. And what we're finding, we're able to ask a bit more in detail and about a larger aspects or different groups, that a majority are reporting that they're seeing multiple types or types of hate speech targeted to different groups. So an unhealthy diet, I guess, is how I might characterize that.
Sadia, what about you? What are you coming up with? I mean, you identified some of the areas that you're targeting.
Right. Yeah. So we focused on group-based hate speech, similar to what Christine's been talking about, where it's all around specific identity groups that are commonly being targeted. We've looked at it on the basis of religion and ethnicity or race, also gender, people with disabilities. More recently, so with the Toxogen project, one of the main focuses was we wanted to look into more implicit cases of hate speech. A lot of the earlier benchmarks and a lot of the models that were trained using that data had examples of racial epithets, for example, or curse words that make it fairly easy to classify, but there's a lot of cases of hate speech where there aren't these obvious indicators that you can hone in on that single word and determine whether or not it's hate speech. You really have to understand the context. And so the work we've been doing recently, and we've picked up on this with our ISH project, is trying to look at examples where you really need to understand the context and to be able to make a determination of whether or not this is hate speech. I think something that we haven't worked on so much yet, but I think is very particular to social media, is that you'll see different mediums through which it can be communicated. So it's not all about speech. It's not all about text. There was this hateful memes challenge a few years ago from Meta that was looking at visual examples of hate. And I think more and more it's becoming an issue with these hateful ideologies being spread through visual mediums, through videos, through images, and that's going to be an increasing concern.
So I'm an historian, and it's music to my ears to hear you say we are trying to sort of refine our understanding of the context in order to be able to distinguish, between what is and what is not offensive or hate-filled. Can you tell us what that looks like? What does it actually mean to, engage in the work to produce context that can help explicate the use of certain words such that we know here they are offending and here they may not be?
Right. So I think one example of this was when we were working on implicit hate speech, there was a post that was praising this group called MGTOW. And this was actually annotated as being a benign example. But when you look into the background and the history of this, then you realize that this group is actually an online community that's been promoting violence against women. It stands for Men Going Their Own Way. And so there's that particular context of knowing that this is a dog whistle. This is actually a reference to this specific community that holds these misogynistic beliefs that not all annotators would be able to identify. There's other examples too. Sometimes it has to do with understanding cultural cues. There are some examples that were targeting Native Americans where it doesn't actually say anything about Indigenous people or about Native Americans, but it's bringing up cultural artifacts and making these offensive generalizations about people. So it has to, there's different ways in which we're thinking about context. So there's historical context. There's the more recent context of understanding specific ideologies or groups. There's context from also understanding how communication or cultural norms change depending on where something is being posted. So when I was giving my introduction before and discussing the project that was involving racial bias, one thing there was the use of reclaimed language, where there are specific words that are offensive if depending on who the speaker is, and who they're communicating to, where within certain groups, then this is acceptable language, and outside of those groups, it's not. And so that's an additional aspect of context that we need to take into
Would
account
that
when
be
thinking
like
about.
the verbal equivalent of reclaiming the Confederate flag as sort of a
Right. We're thinking
symbol of
about
identity?
examples like the N-word. Yeah.
I see. So is this something, to sort of jump ahead to a topic that will engage us, I'm sure, throughout, is this something that AI can play a very prominent role in this work of contextualizing?
So the issue is that right now AI isn't very good at taking context into account. It's
Okay.
one of the main challenges that we've run into. And so in the work that I've been doing, it's about how do we make these systems that are based on automatic content moderation with AI models more contextually aware. A lot of it comes down to thinking about the data that it's been trained on and trying to make sure that we have adequate representation. Another issue that relates to context is victim narrative. So people talking about their own experiences of being targeted by hate speech. And so this can look very similar to actual examples of hate speech. And a lot of the current classifiers will actually label that as being hate speech. And oftentimes that stems from the fact that there weren't specific examples of victim narratives in the training data, or there weren't substantial enough examples for it to actually learn this distinction between somebody targeting another person with hate speech and somebody talking about their own experience. So that's another case where we need context to be able to understand this is actually somebody relating their own experience and maybe trying to get mental health support.
Okay. Christine, I want to go back to you and ask what makes social media distinct or unique as a platform for the transmission of hateful content, comparing it to others. Once upon a time, we had books like the Turner Diaries or music in the late 20th century. You spent a lot of time analyzing data from social media. What makes it unusual in ways that really merit our attention?
I think adding on to some of what Sade's already said, it's a very dynamic experience. So it's very personalized, it's very fast, there's a lot of information and a lot of stimulation. So we know, and we won't get deeply into it, but these apps are designed to keep people's attention, and algorithms are also designed to highlight or amplify those aggressive posts. So what you're seeing, it really is dependent upon some of what's behind it. I think what's really interesting, and I'm thinking again back to my research focusing on adolescents, young adults, it's kind of an interesting cocktail of sorts. So adolescents that are learning to figure out who they are, experimenting, pushing limits of what they can say or do, especially in spaces that may or may not be well supervised. And so I think that's where, again, thinking about the area or ages our work focuses on makes this potentially very a potentially harmful environment for many.
Yeah, and here I think it's important to mention our colleague Safia Noble and her book Algorithms of Oppression, which shows how the actual construction of sort of the guts of social media and the internet direct, conduce, as it were, people toward content that affirms and reinforces prejudices and bias of longstanding duration. But I want to turn to what I think is sort of the big question, maybe the elephant in the room, which is whom do we hold accountable for hate on social media? The purveyors of hate themselves, the generators, the people who produce the content and distribute it, government for not imposing stricter regulations, big tech, parents of children whom you're surveying now, Christine. When you think of this big question, what comes to your mind? What's the kind of hierarchy of responsibility as you see it? Maybe we'll start with you, Christine.
Oh gosh, hierarchy. I mean, I guess all of the above in the sense that we're part of an ecosystem and we all have a role to play. I guess what's on the top of my mind, you said who's most the hierarchy of accountability, perhaps. You know, of course, there is a great deal of need for more regulation, more moderation, accountability by tech or social media. Again, thinking about the research that I do and the sessions that I've sat in with parents, how are we modeling our own behavior? How are we modeling how we interact with individuals, both in person and online? How do the people, especially people we see as leaders in our community, in our environment, how are they interacting with one another? And I think that's really important for all of us to take a step back and reflect on, are we being models for our students, for our children? And again, that's not meaning that that's the top of the hierarchy, but something that I think about a lot.
What about you, Sandhya? How do you understand this question of accountability and where responsibility lies?
Right. I think that ideally there should be accountability at all levels. I do think it's alarming that the way that the law is set up in the US now, we have pretty strong incentives for platforms to remove copyrighted content, but we don't have those incentives for them to remove offensive content that could be harming users. In fact, we have protections of those platforms that de-incentivizes them to take a role, like Section 230, where they don't have in legal liability over a lot of the user content. So I I think it's going to be a very challenging question of how we would implement or enforce a system of accountability. And I do think it's unlikely that there would be some kind of external mandated auditing in the US anytime soon. But I do think that there should be more accountability placed on these social media platforms, ideally through some basic standard of regulation through the government.
Government imposed. Well, you mentioned that you have worked together with, if I understood correctly, a team from Microsoft.
Yes.
So you have some insight into how people on the big tech side work and think. What was that partnership like? I mean, what kinds of cultural differences did you encounter, and do you see potential for that kind of collaboration to yield a better, less dangerous internet and social media?
Yeah. I that was a good experience for me. I think quite eye-opening to get their perspective as well on how we should think about content moderation, what their concerns were, and what they were thinking about in terms of um, their customers and liability. We had some exchanges with their legal team about the very framing of the work that we were doing and how we would release the work. I think that so one of the early discussions that we had with that project was talking about block lists. They had been implementing block lists before, and we were discussing what would
Can you just
be
tell what block lists are?
yeah. So that's one form of doing content moderation where you have a specific list of words or phrases that are banned. And so you're going to say any content that mentions that is going to be removed. And there's been some work that's shown that block lists themselves can't have led to discrimination. You have to be very careful in the way in which that block list is implemented. And of course, there's going to be many examples for which a block list doesn't work, like the implicit hate speech that I was talking about before. Those are cases where they don't contain obvious words that you could ban. So those would get around the block list. So these were all discussions we were having with their product team and with their research team about why we should move to this AI classifier based approach, and why that would be beneficial, not to them, and in terms of dealing with potential liabilities down the line from the systems that they were trying to implement. I think it's critical to have these kind of partnerships with the tech industry in doing this work, because if we're just doing it in isolation in academia, then there's only so much impact that we can have, versus if we're directly interacting with the companies who are putting out products like a Siri and like Alexa, and who are who are running these social media platforms. We have to have direct interaction with them and some back and forth about what they're willing to accept and what they're willing to take on in order to actually implement changes that are going to be affecting as many users as possible, and protecting those users. So I think it's really important to have this exchange between industry and academia. And I also think it's good for figuring out how do we communicate the importance of the work that we're doing and the impact that hate is having on people, and why this should be taken seriously, and why there needs to be more work done, and why the current state of things is not sufficient.
Thanks. Just a reminder that in about 10 minutes, we're going to turn to your questions. So if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screens. So Christine, I'd love to get your assessment of where you think the state of the field is today in hate and social media. How well developed is it relative to the challenge out there? And where would you like to see it go? And for that matter, where do you think it will go?
Oh, good question. So first, I want to piggyback on something I think, Sada, you've talked a lot about, is that there's constant change. So it's not as though these apps are really staying still or static, but there's constant updates and changes in the features that I think is really an important part of the story, and also makes it challenging to study. In terms of the field itself, I think there's a growing body of knowledge, both about, say, habits or the phenomenon, in terms of like how much time is spent, or kind of what kind of hateful things we're seeing. Although conceptions, I think I saw that in one of the questions, like how are young people interpreting or making sense of what is hateful or not, I think is still a question to explore. I think we're beginning to have more awareness with the Surgeon General's advisory last year about the risk factors. So I think that's much more on the front of people's awareness that there are these perhaps associations or connections with harms. What we don't understand very well, and where I hope the research goes, is to really tease apart or understand longitudinally, looking across time at individuals. What does it mean if you're spending multiple hours per day on social media? What does that look like in terms of impacts on your learning, on your social emotional development over time? So that's an area I think
we still don't have such longitudinal studies.
Not necessarily, and I think some of the most important information, understanding about, say, vulnerable groups of young people, some of those types of data are very difficult and becoming even more difficult to collect in the current environment. I think also more work around collaboration. So we work with the nonprofit. We're trying to really reach out to the community because I think that's the youth voice. So working with young people, working with communities, those people on the ground is essential. Let's see. So those are a few things. Also just methodologically speaking. So some of the things that I've reported on are self-report. What would be really great is to understand, to be able to look at the feed, to articulate more like, what about this is hateful to you? I think that's a linchpin to it. But that also both is challenging and also jumps into questions of privacy and ethical questions. So those are a few thoughts on the top of my head.
Great. And Sanjay, what about you? Where do you think the field is at present? Where do you think it's going? Where do you think it should go? And I guess, again, can you weigh in on the impact of AI, which is something you think a lot about?
Yeah, yeah. So I'll talk a little bit about the impact of AI. So I think that there's a lot of positive that has come out of the development of AI models for automatic content moderation. One of those being that this alleviates some of the burden of content moderators, where they face a lot of mental health challenges with dealing with this constant onslaught of hate speech, and so if we can remove some of that burden and some of that overload from humans that through the use of AI, I think that is ultimately a benefit for everyone. There, of course, it's not perfect. There's a lot of there's a lot of limitations still with AI-based classifiers, which is the motivation for much of the work that I'm doing now. And there's a potential for harm coming out of that as well. For example, when we find them discriminating against certain speakers, or we find them erasing people's narratives incorrectly, then that obviously poses a harm. But I think that a lot of progress has been made already and is going to continue to be made. So I'm going to say that I'm fairly optimistic about the direction everything has been going in terms of integrating AI.
Okay. So I think I'm going to ask you one more question, and then we're going to go to those that are in the Q&A. And here it's asking you to put on a different hat, which is the policymaker hat, and to be as specific as possible in thinking about guidelines that you would like to see in place in regulating hate in social media. And again, we face that kind of perpetual conundrum of the fact that the people who are currently regulating are the very people who have produced the social media platforms and are most interested in promoting them. So, Christine, what are your thoughts?
Sure. First off, I guess one thing that I would suggest is, and I'm taking this a little bit of a different direction, is some of the comments have made this as well. Hate will be, I think, getting rid of hate on social media might be a difficult, if not never-ending task. So one thing that I would suggest in terms of legislation or policy is to really make sure that we embed a more rigorous opportunities for young people to engage in digital literacy, media literacy, education. What we find from our undergraduates is that a sizable proportion report they never really talked to anyone, whether it was an adult, a teacher, a parent, a peer when they were younger, about being safe on social media, about 20%. And so finding ways to embed within their daily experience opportunities to really critically think about what they're seeing, learning more about spotting disinformation, misinformation, how to be resilient when they do encounter things that are harmful or hateful. I think that's essential.
What about you, Sadia?
Yeah, I really like the point that Christine raised about the education side of it, and making people aware of how to identify and handle hate themselves. I think
Mm.
inevitably there's only so much of this that we can curb, even if we do come up with better automatic methods. And so we really need to give people the tools to be able to handle that. Well, I think part of that is also thinking about the particular ways in which we implement content moderation. There's been this move towards community notes with X and with now Meta. I and there's I have I
Right,
take
could you say
issue
that
with
again?
this
Can you say that again? What is it?
community notes. So this is a
Community
kind
notes.
of content moderation that's crowdsourced. And I take issue with this because it's removing liability from the social media platforms that are saying everybody, the users are the content moderators and they're responsible for flagging content and then providing explanations for why that's harmful. But there are also aspects of this kind of approach I like. I like the idea of having some type of counter speech or explanations that instead of removing content outright, point out why it's wrong. Because I think that can have more of an impact than if we just remove some examples. And there's going to be other examples of that don't get removed versus if we take this kind of explanatory approach, people see that and they can learn something from that helps them in handling other examples that they later encounter.
Right,
Um,
so I understand the importance of the educational piece, which both you
right,
and
right, right.
are you
Yeah,
content with the community notes model, or do you think it needs to be revised, sharpened, transformed?
it has its flaws. There have been a few flaws raised, including scalability is an issue. There's issues around polarization, and particularly when we're thinking about the cases of it for flagging misinformation, people will not agree, and so then they don't actually use those notes. They never see the light of day. Um, so there's definitely flaws, but I think that some version of that is ultimately I think that is a good model to aim for. Um, I want to add on to this point about education and talk uh, about some other considerations. And one thing is that I think that there needs to be um, more standardization in terms of how we develop AI models for this specifically that takes into account representation from people who have been targeted and does focus more on um, bringing in perspectives from targeted communities because
Mhm.
a lot of the previous work that has been done in this space overlooked that.
Mhm.
And so that's where we see some issues cropping up, like there being errors in the actual annotation where people didn't understand things like reclaimed language or
Mhm.
dialectical variation or implicit examples because they didn't have the lived experiences to actually be able to label that correctly. And so I think that there needs to be either um, some more standardization around training so that even if people don't have those perspectives, that they'll have some background that helps them in distinguishing cases where somebody who did come from that experience would be able to identify that, or there needs to be more representation uh,
Right.
across those groups in the annotation itself.
Got it. One common thread that I'm hearing in what you have said over the course of the 45 minutes we've been talking, and Christine as well, is that we shouldn't expect the vector of change necessarily to come from the top down, but you're emphasizing bottom up empowerment of consumers to equip themselves and to receive tools that allow them to be the regulators of the filters, and not just wait for some miraculous intervention by a long-awaited juncture of government and for-profit companies. So in that vein, I want to turn to our first question, which asks you, Sadia, about how people who've been the targets of hate can participate in creating models to combat hate speech.
Right.
Yeah. Can you say a bit more about this? The questioner asks.
Yeah. So for the current project we're working on with the Initiative to Study Hate, then we're doing crowdsourced annotation, which is the common procedure for doing this kind of large-scale hate speech data collection in the past. But we're specifically focusing on making sure we have balanced representation across targeted groups. And then we're looking at the differences in annotation between in-group annotators and out-group annotators. So people who identify as that particular group that's being targeted and people who do not. And we do see some deviation there, where there is significant, it varies across the different groups, but for a number of the groups, then we're seeing some significant difference in how they actually label these examples. And so our ultimate goal is that we're going to be training models where we have these in-group annotations as the gold labels.
Okay, so one questioner asks, I think, what could be a very simple yes or no question. Are we able to figure out, to decipher the origin of comments, where they come from? Do they come from the United States? Do they come from abroad? How precise can we be in finding out where hateful content is coming from, or not at all? Sadia, I guess we'll turn to you first. Do we have the capacity to know?
Yeah. I think this is a very challenging question, because of the nature of social media, where a lot of times um, posts will be decontextualized to some degree. And and another aspect is the anonymity of social media, which I think is one of the factors that makes hate speech particularly pervasive on social media, is that people can hide behind a mask. And so they would say things that they wouldn't say in person. Um, so that's, yeah, in terms of identifying regions that it's coming from, that's going to be very difficult.
Is that something
We
which we'll be able to get more sophisticated at, or is that not likely to happen?
mm, I think it's just the nature of social media that's going to be hard to do. There's some degree of uh geolocation that's possible with social media posts. But it's, I think that's always going to be a challenge that we run up against. We mostly, in the prior research that I've worked on, we've mostly been focusing on US based norms, and US based cultural context.
Mhm.
So we are exploring the kind of hateful narratives that stem from our US biases and the history that we've had here. Um, I think that, though I think that a lot of this may translate when we're thinking about this at a more global level, but of course there's going to be individual um, individual uh, characteristics of hate that comes out based on the particular geopolitical, historical aspects of other regions. But yeah,
Well,
I think my basic answer to this question is that that's going to always be very challenging.
well, I mean, we are at a very specific geopolitical moment here in the United States, we don't need to extend beyond the country to talk about a very intense and supercharged
Right.
environment, and one in which the new regime is intent on both deregulation as a kind of way of being, and also when it comes to social media, highlighting and foregrounding free speech over protections or uh, 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 safeguards. So, Christine, I'm wondering, I mean, you deal with a population that is at one level um, completely consumed by social media and quite vulnerable. What does this moment look like to you?
Ah, scary. No. And I'm also a parent of a teen, so I see it in a few different ways. Um, I think going back to something that you said, Saudi, and I should have said as well, is that notion of not really knowing who's behind the screen. Kids are very well aware of that. They don't have high hopes. Thinking about the interviews and discussions we've had, they don't have high hopes or expectations right now that there's going to be regulation or companies that are going to be watching out for their best interest. So I guess if there's one ray of hope, it's that there is this power, I think, amongst a lot of young people that they really have to forge their own path. I think that thinking about AI, I mean, this is it could be such an area of rich discussion to have, both within schools, within families, just about what does that mean? What do we want the future to look like? How does it work? Because just because I'm older, it's not that I have any more knowledge or experience. We're all going through this together. And so I guess that's my hope, is that I think there's such wisdom with the individuals that I've spoken to and interviewed as part of this study, especially those undergraduates who've been able to look across time and see their younger selves and where they are now.
Hmm. Well, you know, in that regard, another questioner asked about sort of the hypersensitivity of Gen Z and sort of, you know, the desire that many parents have to create safe environments for children, and which may have the effect of limiting their exposure to different ideas, challenging ideas, even offensive ideas that would allow them to grow intellectually. So, I mean, you deal with the population that this question is asking about all the time. How do you think about this? You know, where do you draw the line between, you know, what is, you know, unacceptably offensive and what is challenging when one thinks about hate speech?
Gosh, I mean, that is a big question. And I think that there are perhaps things that do cross the line regardless, especially some of the, like what Saudi, if you've been talking about, some of the language and violence or aggression. But I think connected to that are those discussions or understanding of perspectives, which I think are critical. Why is that offensive to you? And having those conversations. One thing that we're seeing in the literature or research is that the sense of empathy, we just see decrease over time in general. There are some longitudinal studies there, not necessarily online, but just in general, young people reporting lower levels of empathy and spending more time on social media, especially looking at hateful content. We worry about decreased levels of empathy. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but I think it's not that we're trying to protect our children from all at all in harm's way, but there are things that are just not developmentally appropriate in spaces that they really just aren't necessarily meant to be in. But we don't always know what those are, especially as someone who didn't grow up in that.
Right. So, Sajid, I want to go back to the question about the political moment we're in, and what are you feeling and seeing as the challenges of the moment, the challenges of the day, especially when, again, the new Trump administration is very keen on deregulation and on
Right.
popping up, you know, the idea of free speech as a cardinal principle when it comes to social media and the internet.
Yeah, yeah. I think this is just going to make our work so much more challenging, especially with the DEI pushback, and the fact that there's now at a government level, we're dealing with cases of the truth being very loosely defined, and increasing polarization. So I think our work is more important than ever, but I also think it's more challenging than ever. We're going to have to be creative and thinking, how do we deal with some of the obstacles that have been raised, like the pushback against DEI. I think something interesting that's emerged. This is not a new phenomenon per se, but worsening and definitely a worsening phenomenon is the intersection of misinformation and hate speech. We've had some discussions around the wildfires and the ways in LA and that happened recently, and the way that that's been framed by some in a way that is discriminatory against certain groups, and while it may not cross over per se into hate speech from political figures, then it definitely enables hate speech, and it creates an environment that's more conducive to that. So I find that really dangerous and concerning. And I think the point that Christine was raising about education, and trying to break through some of these barriers that have been raised because of the polarization is going to be critical. I do a lot of work around misinformation as well, and I've been doing some work on how do we uh, develop counter narratives to misinformation that can cross over ideological barriers. And so I think that direction is going to be really important in terms of figuring out how do we frame our rhetoric in such a way that we're not making it seem like people, because they hold a certain ideology, are wrong, or not trying to just present them with facts, but trying to have some level of empathy for their position and for their ideologies, while at the same time pushing back on aspects of that that could be conducive to creating hateful environments.
And on that note, and perhaps by way of conclusion, I just want to let the audience know that next week, the Initiative to Study Hate will be putting out a toolkit that is intended to combat mis and disinformation relating to the wildfires in Los Angeles. And the two people with whom we've been in conversation, Sadia and Christine, have been key architects of that toolkit, and you can find it on the studyofhate.ucla.edu website, and probably in other places on the internet. So with that, Vicki, I think we'll hand things back to you.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all of our amazing discussants, Dr. David Myers, Dr. Christine Ong, and Dr. Sadia Gabriel. This was a fascinating discussion on hate in the internet and gave us so much to think about. And it's certainly a challenging time, and this is it's always evolving. So as soon as we think we have something figured out, it changes. So thank you. A special thank you to Dr. David Myers and the State of Hate Initiative for giving us the privilege of co-hosting this three-part series with you. And
It's a pleasure, Vicki.
thank you. And if anybody missed any of the programs, which if you did, I highly recommend that you go to our website, Friends of Semel Institute. They were all taped and you can watch them and really get a great education on the state of hate. So thank you everybody for the privilege of your time. We hope to see you again very soon. Our next Open Mind is just around the corner, February 20th, with the author Jonathan Rosen, who wrote a fascinating memoir, The Best Minds, a story of friendship, madness, and the tragedy of good intentions. So I hope to see everybody there. In the meantime, stay safe, stay well, be kind, have empathy, be careful on social media, and have a good evening. Good night.
Thank you.
Bye.